So today we're going to talk about the novel The Picture of Dorian Gray by the Irish writer Oscar Wilde. The Picture of Dorian Gray was first published in 1890 and it is the only novel by Oscar Wilde, who is better known as a playwright. Perhaps his most famous play is The Importance of Being Earnest, which is often also considered his masterpiece. But today we're going to look at his only novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray, which is also his most controversial work, and we'll see why in this video. The Picture of Dorian Gray is a mix between a Gothic novel is a kind of horror novel, and a philosophical novel with echoes to the German myth Faust as explored by previous writers such as Goethe in Germany or Marlowe in England. But before I go into this novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray, I would like to speak a little bit about its author, Oscar Wilde, and what I think is important to know about his biography before you read the novel, okay? I do like to talk about those aspects of an author's life that impact his or her work, or those aspects that might shed light on the writing, but this is something that varies greatly between writers, right? In Oscar Wilde's case, I think knowing certain things about his life is not just interesting, but it's also hugely important if we are to appreciate his writing. To my mind, Oscar Wilde is a prime example of a writer whose life and literary production are intimately linked. In fact, I think it would be challenging to talk about anything Oscar Wilde wrote without referring to his life, because he often does mix his life and his work. I would say that is one of the main characteristics of Oscar Wilde as an artist. I think Oscar Wilde saw his life also as a work of art. Okay, let's talk a little bit about his life. He went to Trinity College in Dublin and Magdalen College in Oxford, England. He studied classics, mainly Greek literature. He became famous even before he had published much of any notice. In fact, he toured the United States in 1882, giving lectures on aestheticism. More on that later. We can think of Oscar Wilde as a celebrity, but sometimes his public appearances were met with, let's say, incomprehension by some people. But I think the important thing about all this is the fact that Oscar Wilde was a celebrity before being a writer. He was already famous before he published The Picture of Dorian Gray or any of his now famous plays. Oscar Wilde's status as a celebrity is something I think very modern. I know that this is a cliche, but Oscar Wilde seems to have been almost ahead of its time. His status as a celebrity and how he cultivated a very specific self-image is something that speaks to us. I think it is something that most people now would understand, and I'm talking to you from YouTube, right? And that must be why this novel in particular speaks to us so loudly and why it has become a classic, in the sense of being almost timeless and having something to tell us now, more than 100 years after its publication. So, Oscar Wilde lectured on aestheticism, I said that, but what does that mean? In this context, aestheticism is hard to define, and I'm not going to dive deep into it, but just talk briefly about what it meant to Oscar Wilde. Aestheticism as a literary movement precedes Wilde, so he didn't invent it. It was a wave that he gladly rode on. So, according to Wilde, art was above nature. Art is what matters, and more importantly, according to him, art doesn't imitate life or nature. It is life that imitates art. That idea, I think, it encapsulates what Oscar Wilde thought about aestheticism and what you should know about it. So he was famous, and he has become famous to this day for writing against commonplace ideas. And I am loath to quote any of them because I'm not sure everything that you find on the internet as having been said or written by him actually was, and I suspect that some quotations attributed to him are probably apocryphal. And you can always Google Oscar Wilde quotations for yourself or buy any of the myriad available books that include quotes and aphorisms attributed to him. Anyway, Oscar Wilde challenges commonplace ideas. Why? Because he believes that literature provides writers with the space to write anything they want. And you can see in his writing a willingness or a desire to be original, a desire to put forward a fresh view on things and to challenge what was established and considered acceptable in aesthetic terms. Mostly, what Oscar Wilde, I think, wanted to achieve was to exorcise any moral notion from fiction writing and instead confer writing with beauty for its own sake. I hope this makes sense, but I think the best way to understand all of this would be to read the picture of Dorian Gray and pay close attention to the language that is used in the text. Now, this all may seem okay to us now, like a totally legitimate position for a writer to assume, but you have to think that in the context of the Victorian era, some of Wilde's ideas were, if not shocking, at least controversial. People, readers and critics alike, were not always ready to accept aestheticism back then. But what was most shocking to most people back then was not Oscar Wilde's writing, but his private life, which unfortunately became public knowledge when he became involved in a sex scandal that ended up by putting him in jail. And this is upsetting, okay? So if Oscar Wilde started his career as a celebrity and then became celebrated as a writer, he also had a regrettably quick fall. He was judged for being homosexual. Homosexuality was a crime in Victorian England, and the crime was typified as sodomy. The trial for sodomy happened at the peak of his career as a writer, playwright, and journalist, which gave the whole scandal an even higher profile. Now, you have to think that he was one of the most famous writers in England back then, possibly even one of the most famous writers in the whole of Europe at the time of the scandal. So, the scandal and the trial meant a sharp fall into disgrace for him. Oscar Wilde had a romantic relationship with a younger aristocrat, Lord Alfred Douglas. The problem is that Alfie's father, the Marquess of Queensberry, you couldn't make it up, strongly disapproved of the relationship between Oscar Wilde and his son Alfie. Oscar Wilde was married to a woman because men were only allowed to marry women back then, and in England, and they had children, but he was in love, or at least he was in a relationship with Alfie, the young aristocrat. Now, the legal trouble began when Alfie's father accused Oscar Wilde of sodomy by leaving a note in the gentleman's club Wilde frequented. And I think I have to clarify what a gentleman's club is, or was. Okay, now it's a strip club, I think, but back then it was a place for rich and aristocratic men to hang out, smoke cigars, have a drink, talk about politics, do what we would now call networking, that kind of thing, okay? So, well, the problem was that Oscar Wilde decided to sue Alfie's father, the Marquess, for libel for the note. As it turns out, that was a huge mistake. So, to defend himself from libel, the Marquess hired some detectives who could find out proof of Oscar Wilde's homosexual activities, and lo and behold, they found plenty of it. Why? Because Oscar Wilde liked to hire male prostitutes, and that was easy enough to prove. Remember once more that homosexual activities were a crime in England back then, okay? So with the proof he got, the Marquess, Alfie's father, was able to sue Oscar Wilde for gross indecent behavior. Now, the whole thing turns my stomach. I found it incredibly upsetting, but that was the hypocrisy that reigned in Victorian England or Britain, and also in the colonies. But that's for another time, I think. In fact, you know, that law, this is interesting, that law against gross indecency had only been passed not that long before all of this happened. So it's not something that belongs to England's past. It's specifically Victorian, right? It's a law that didn't exist before the Victorian era, and I think this is important. So Oscar Wilde was sentenced to 2 years in jail and forced labor. And I shudder to think what someone as refined as Oscar Wilde would have felt in jail and forced to do physical labor. So it's not all bad news, because while in jail, Oscar Wilde wrote De Profundis, which I would also strongly recommend. Okay. Finally, you know, Oscar Wilde died in his French exile. Why France? France had a legislation that was notably less homophobic than that of Britain. He died in November of 1900. And if you want to know more about the life and Oscar Wilde, I barely scratched the surface here. I think the best biography, I think, continues to be the one written by Richard Ellman, which I will link to together with the picture of Dorian Gray in the description box for this video, so you can check that out later. Okay, let's talk now about the picture of Dorian Gray specifically, because it has a very interesting publishing history. So the first version of this novel was published in a magazine, an American magazine called Lippincott's Monthly. It was published in 1890 in America. So the novel was first published in the United States. Oscar Wilde was already famous in the United States because of that tour I mentioned a moment ago. In fact, he was internationally famous, not just when he published this book, but during his lifetime. So the first version that was published in a magazine, in that magazine, is not the version we read today. In fact, there are two versions that we read today, but more on that in a minute. So Oscar Wilde rewrote a lot of the novel before he published it in a book format in 1891, so 1 year after the publication in the magazine. So the first book edition has a preface in which Oscar Wilde defends his novel. But despite all the, I'm going to call it watering down, and everything that was cut off from the picture of Dorian Gray, and then, you know, when it was published as a magazine, right? And then all the changes Oscar Wilde made between its publication in the magazine and its publication as a book, the novel was actually poorly received in the late 19th century. And this could be shocking to us because it's such a good book. The novel only became acclaimed much later. So the picture of Dorian Gray has a homosexual subtext. That's clear to most people who read it. But originally, references to male homosexuality were a lot more obvious, right? So in the version that he first wrote, but that version was never published. The American editor heavily censored a lot of that in the version that came out in the magazine. If you want to read that original version, the uncensored version, you need to get this edition, the edition I have, the edition that I've been holding up throughout this video. But this version only came out in 2011. 2011. So I first read the picture of Dorian Gray back in college in the late 1990s. And back then, this edition was not available. The only available edition was censored. So this version here, the one that I'm holding up, is a lot more explicit than the one I read before, and possibly the one that you have read. I don't know. And this is the one I would suggest you pick up if you can. So the version that we could read before 2011, so the version that Oscar Wilde rewrote and came out in 1891, was just went through two processes of censorship. First by its American editor, and then by Oscar Wilde himself, who worked for a whole year to make the novel more palatable for the general reading public in Victorian times. So the American edition, the magazine edition, removed a lot from the novel. Actually, hundreds of words, even whole sentences were removed. So Oscar Wilde had to work in order to add more text to the novel. But also he had to emphasize the reprehensive nature of Dorian Gray's behavior in the novel. In this novel, Dorian Gray is a young man. Okay, he's extremely good looking. He is friends with a painter, Basil Howard, who is infatuated with Dorian's beauty. At least that's what is explicit in the text. But it seems obvious to me that, and I think to most people, that Basil is actually in love with Dorian Gray and not just infatuated with his beauty, okay? So Basil Howard has a friend, Lord Henry Wotton, who also becomes enthralled, okay, by Dorian's beauty when they first meet. Basil is afraid, the painter is afraid that Lord Henry Wotton, his friend, would influence Dorian Gray negatively, which is exactly what happens, of course. Lord Henry Wotton is an aristocratic hedonist, someone for whom the pursuit of pleasure is the most important, or perhaps even more than that, the only important part of life. Two important things happen then. Basil paints Dorian's portrait, while Dorian learns from Wotton that hedonism only values beauty and pleasure. So, under the influence of Wotton, Dorian Gray expresses his desire to never grow old. And then happens what everybody, even people who have never read the picture of Dorian Gray, knows about it. Which is that Dorian stays young and beautiful, while in the portrait, his portrait gets older and grows uglier as time goes by. But it is not just time what makes the figure in the portrait get older. The more Dorian gives himself over to a life of instant gratification, pleasure, and debauchery, the uglier the figure in the portrait becomes. Dorian never makes a Faustian pact or a pact with the devil explicitly like that, right? He doesn't talk to the devil or anything like that, but there are clear echoes, I think, of that kind of Faustian pact in the novel. However, I think that Oscar Wilde goes beyond the myth of Faust, because what he's talking about in his novel is art. Okay, now I want to draw attention to a key episode in the novel, which is when Dorian falls in love with a beautiful actress who seems to lose all her talent, all the talent she had, the moment she corresponds to Dorian's love. And something that she, the actress, tells Dorian to explain how her love for him has made her a lesser actress, ironically makes him stop loving her. There is, of course, a lot more to that episode, but, you know, I don't want to spoil it. I don't like to spoil books I review, and I just wanted to call your attention to that key episode in the novel in case you are going to read it soon, or if you are going to reread it, I would ask you to pay attention to that. Okay, there are two main ideas in tension throughout the whole novel, throughout the picture of Dorian Gray. So, on the one hand, there is the idea that aestheticism, the aestheticism that I talked about briefly a moment ago, you know, whereby what matters is beauty, what's on the surface. Okay, so that's one idea. But on the other hand, we have the condemnation of Dorian's behavior. Dorian Gray is the character that best personifies aestheticism and its values in the novel. Dorian lives his life, or at least begins to do so after he meets Lord Henry Wotton, by the same ideas that aestheticism promotes. And yet, the novel seems to condemn him for taking all of that to incredible extremes. But, of course, I won't tell you to what extremes Dorian takes his aestheticism, because I think that finding out it's one of the pleasures of reading this novel, and I am loath to take that away from you. Okay, so I won't spoil anything about that, about what he does and what makes the portrait gets older and uglier, okay? I would say though that Dorian Gray is a fascinating character. He's someone not only beautiful, but also smart, witty. Witty in a way that I think only Oscar Wilde could have written. So, The Picture of Dorian Gray is a novel that drips with wit. Which is why I would say that if you want to read something that is smart, beautiful, and shocking, all those three things and a whole lot more at the same time, you need to read The Picture of Dorian Gray. I won't lie to you, this novel can also be disturbing. Remember that it has gothic elements, but it is also beautifully written. And at least for me, it's an unputdownable novel.